The Automated Podcast.
So hi there, everybody. It's Marc Verbenkov, and welcome back to another Automated Podcast episode after a lengthy summer break. So as I mentioned, in early August, I spent some 11 days trekking through the Pyrenees mountains, which I highly recommend to everybody as a bit of an enforced, I guess you could say, digital detox. Feels really great, especially as we move into a more highly connected society. But it's also really good to be back, setting up new discussions and looking at automation, technologies, and all the changes that are coming our way. But we can jump right into today's episode, which is actually a presentation that I gave to an online conference focusing on podcasting right before my summer break. So the conference itself actually set the Guinness World Record for the largest online podcasting conference. So it was nice to be a part of that. So I was initially invited by Lily Wong, who's a very well-known podcaster herself in China, who you will actually hear at the start and end of the recording. And she asked me to join the conference and explain how certain technologies will impact the podcasting industry, as well as the ability to create or design podcasts. So if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, this episode might actually be especially interesting for you. But just to note before we start, I did have a number of visuals that went along with my presentation. So if you want to see those, I'll have the episode up on YouTube. On the YouTube channel, I think you can just find it just by searching Automated Podcast on YouTube, which also has all the other episodes on there, just in case you prefer to use that platform to listen to your podcasts. So that's all I really had to say for this intro. I hope everybody had a wonderful summer holiday, and I guess we can jump right into this episode.
They are actually watching live from all over the world. Yeah, right. So I'll give the mic to you. Let's get the party started.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Well, hi there, everybody. So as Lily said, my name is Marc Verbenkov. I'll give you a quick, really quick bio, and then we can get into the content of the slides and presentation. So I'm a futurist. I'm working on European projects trying to advance the state of the art of different kinds of technologies like AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles, exoskeletons, etc. And then also trying to bring these technologies to the market across predominantly Europe. So, but maybe a little bit more relevantly, I'm the host of a podcast called Automated, where myself and the guests that I bring on explore how these kind of different technologies, like the ones that I mentioned, but also a number of other ones, are having real impacts on jobs and society and us as individuals, but across the entire world. So that's a really brief intro. Very quickly, we can look at some of the things that we'll be looking at. I really want to focus on three main things. So a quick overview of the podcast industry. As we're all talking about podcasting, I thought it would be an interesting idea to look at the actual context of what we're all talking about. And then the kind of two main things that I think is more interesting for everybody: the future of podcasting for listeners as well as creators. So those are the three main things, and then there will be a short Q&A afterwards if there's enough time. So first off, the podcast industry. So just a couple of minutes, but I thought it would be interesting to look. I think everybody here is aware that over the last 5 to maybe 6 years, the industry has really been booming, right? Even some people have been saying that it's exploded in both numbers of people listening, as well as podcasts being created, and all these kind of different metrics that you can use to kind of measure the growth of an industry. So I have two slides here, two graphs. One is podcast familiarity, and that's really very simple. It's who actually knows what podcast actually means. And as you can see, the numbers have gone up substantially. This is only focused on the US, but the numbers are relatively the same in most developed countries that you look around the world. And then secondly, here we have the maybe a bit more relevant and a little bit more of a key metric to look at. This is how many listeners are actually listening to these podcasts. So again, the same thing, it's constantly going up. And there's the full expectation that this will continue as the years go on. I wanted to try and find a specific number of podcasts that exist around the world. There are so many different sources that say different things. It was a little bit tricky, but the total that I now believe from all the sources that I looked at is between 1 to 2 million podcasts. And this is across the entire world. To maybe give a better sense of the actual growth, you can look at Apple Podcasts, which is still the kind of main place where podcasts are listened to. And over the span of 2 years, I believe it was 2017 to 2019, they went from 550,000 podcasts to 850,000. So only within 2 years, there was a growth of some 300,000 podcasts just on Apple. But what do all of these stats mean, right? I could stay here for an hour and ramble on stats for all of you. What this means is that the industry has become much more appetizing for corporations as well as large names, and they have started to come into the podcasting industry or podcast space. So these are some examples that I was able to find of the larger names, as well as some of the money that's coming into the space. So here you can look at, the New York Times. They have a daily podcast, and more recently, Michelle Obama and Oprah Winfrey, two very large names, have recently stated that they're going to start podcasts. So we're really starting to see large money as well come into the space. And most notably out of everybody, it's Spotify that has been kind of dominating the headlines over the last year or so. So I think I know Lily, but maybe several other of you use Anchor as a podcast platform to both record and edit and then send out and publish your podcast. So last year, Spotify bought Anchor and Gimlet, another podcasting organization, totaling some $500 million US. And then this year, maybe some of you have heard, there was the leasing agreement for the Joe Rogan podcast, one, if not the largest podcast on the planet, where Spotify is now leasing the rights to have the exclusive use of this podcast on Spotify for an estimated 100 million dollars as well. So you can see that there's clearly growth, there's clearly money coming in. But again, what does this mean, right? It's interesting to see these things, but what does this mean? It means that there's new interest, and more importantly, there are new technologies and new services that are going to be created for podcasts, for both listeners as well as creators. So this is what I kind of want to focus on for the duration and for the rest of my presentation here. And we can start off by looking at the future of listening. So I think that maybe one of the big things that's happened even the last couple months is the way in which listeners listen to podcasts and how that has changed, right? So we are now in a more or less remote working paradigm where many people used to listen to podcasts on their smartphones or in their vehicles going to and from work. Now the numbers show that podcasts are being listened to at home, mostly through voice assistants like Google Home or Amazon Alexa. And an interesting thing here is that the number of these smart home assistants like Amazon Alexa are expected to triple over the next 3 years. So they're going to be, again, this is estimated, but about 8 billion of those by 2023. So, but why is this important? So you can actually say to Alexa, say for instance, play the Michelle Obama podcast, and it will do this. It will start playing the podcast from either the newest or the first episode. However, this isn't necessarily the case for the smaller episodes. So if you were to, for instance, to say, Alexa, play Marc Verbenkov's automated podcast, it will most probably have some difficulty finding that because my podcast is not a massive one like the future Michelle Obama podcast. So this is a problem. But there are changes being made, as I mentioned, all the money, all the new technology, all the different interest and services coming to the space. This is changing. One good example of this is, again, looking at Spotify. So they have something called the voice support that is pretty much built into the platform right now, but it's being built out further and integrated across all their devices. So this is where, much like Amazon's Alexa, you can speak to your Spotify app and it will search and find the specific songs or
in the future, the podcast that you're looking for. So it's the interesting point with Spotify is that it already works on many different devices, right? Your laptop, your cell phone, your home device, etc. So it's really not too far off to argue that in the next couple of years, those of us that have smart clocks will actually be able to be woken up with the latest episode of your favorite podcast rather than some annoying ringer or some music that you may have chosen. So that's kind of one main way that the future of listening to podcasts is changing. Another one is really all based on artificial intelligence. So much like how Netflix, which I'm sure many of us are using, it sends recommendations for new movies or TV shows that that's based on those that you've already watched. Podcast platforms like Spotify, like Apple, like the Stitcher and others are going to start giving better and more recommendations, as well as notifications to kind of keep their listeners engaged. So this could then also be pushed to your home assistant, right? Where the home assistant would be able to speak to you and say, hey, this new podcast episode is up. Do you want to listen to it? And this fits into the second aspect where AI is really powerful in the future of listening for podcasts and increasing the engagement of listeners. So it's really easy for AI algorithms to note when you are doing certain activities on, say, your cell phone or your home assistant or whatever. It's really easy to capture that data. So it's also then really easy for these AI systems to recommend to you at specific times where you're more likely to start listening to a podcast, which podcast you might want to be listening to, right? So all this really does is drastically increase the probability that you will be listening to podcasts and to relevant podcasts and to, I guess, just podcasts in general. So it really increases the engagement, the listenership, and the numbers that many podcast creators are interested in to kind of denote whether your podcast is successful or not. So those are kind of the main future of listening as regards to podcast aspects. I think we can start looking at the future of the creation of podcasts. And there's three main things that I want to quickly get across to all of you. So the first is already there, more or less. It's just going to continue to grow. And that has to do with data or big data. So perhaps not as detailed as YouTube videos yet, but many of the podcasting statistics that are available to us do show things like when listeners are starting to listen to your podcast, or when are they likely to skip, or when have they skipped, or when have they actually stopped listening. And if analyzed correctly, these data points are going to be able to enable you to make slight changes or even large changes to your podcast to make it more enjoyable and more interesting for your listeners, which then, of course, increases the engagement of the podcast for your listeners. So as I mentioned, this is already there now. Many platforms like Libsyn, for instance, have very detailed data and statistics for you, but this is going to grow considerably and get cheaper. I think for Libsyn right now, you have to pay an advance rate to get more of the statistics that you would say for YouTube. If you create YouTube videos, it's free and it's kind of built into the platform. So this is going to happen for podcasting too. But again, this is something that's already there, and it's only going to change a little bit as time goes on. But there's two things, and these are kind of the last things that I'll be talking about here, that are really interesting for the future of the creation of podcasts. And one has to do with transcription. So right now, there are several podcasting supporting businesses out there that will transcribe your podcast if you send them the audio file. This is typically done by a person behind a desk, and they take a lot of time to generate the transcription for you. However, I even looked just a couple days, and there's an organization out there called podcast.co that has an AI tool that enables you to generate a full episode transcript with the simple click of a button. So this is cheaper, it's faster, it's more convenient. And as, again, time goes on, it will get better, and it will create maybe more relevant transcriptions to exactly what you're saying, so a little bit more efficient. But the
tool exists there right now. It's just not being used by everybody. And of course, as those of us that are podcast hosts and creators, we know that transcripts are really important for the SEO or the search engine optimization of your website, but also gives your listeners an ability to kind of scan what you're going to be saying or what your guest is going to be saying on your podcast to give them a sense of what the podcast is actually going to be like. But the last thing that I want to talk about, which I think is really interesting and really shows the future of what podcasts are going to be like for creators, really comes from a company called Descript. And this is two parts. So one is it has an audio file that is then transformed into a text file. So, you have your podcast, you record it, you use Descript's tool, and it creates a text file that you can edit. And then it re-uploads or retransforms that text file into an audio file. So great, you can get rid of simple mistakes or repeated words simply by highlighting and deleting those words in text, rather than using a sophisticated and complicated, at times, audio editing software. But the next thing that I think is really interesting is their audio dub tool. And this enables an AI tool to learn how you speak just by reading a couple sentences for 10 to 15 minutes. So it's the same thing. However, instead of just deleting the text, it also enables you to add text. So you're actually able to create different sentences or different pitches, and the AI will actually mimic your voice simply by reading the text file. Now, maybe this is a little bit hard to understand. I do have a quick 30-40 second audio clip. So hopefully you can hear the audio, but I'll play it now to give you a real sense of what this new tool is enabling podcast creators to do.
Hi, my name is Catherine, and I'm a real person. And I am Catherine. I'm Catherine's overdub voice. I created Catherine by recording 10 minutes of audio into Descript. Thank you. No, thank you. It's hard to express how grateful I am. Now I can edit my recordings as easily as I edit text. No, thank you. It's hard to tell you just how grateful I am. Now I can edit my recordings as easily as I edit text. I can't wait to see what we create together. I can't wait to see what we create together. I'm so happy I made you.
I will maybe share, if we send something out at the end of this, I can share the video links that you can get a better sense for it. But pretty much, it's an AI system that's able to mimic your voice so that you can write text and the AI will then speak for you. So you can generally create a podcast simply from writing text. So a blog post can practically instantly become an audio podcast episode, which I think is pretty powerful. So where does this leave us with? So as I said, these tools are going to get more powerful. They're going to get easier to use, as well as numerous as the years go by, as all this money and different services and technologies come into the space. I really think that overall it will become much, much easier to be a podcaster, as well as, and maybe more importantly, to have a high quality show. I think that this is really interesting as I talk about on my podcast, The Future of Jobs, and how many people are now becoming kind of an independent professional or digital nomads, and branding is very important for this. And I think that as the space develops, podcasting will become even an essential part of this new way of working. And some might become, or might say that having a podcast will be as essential as having a good CV in the future. So that's my presentation. I kind of lost track of time, Lily. So if there is time for Q&A, feel free to ask it, and I will be able to respond to any of your questions.
Hey guys, Chris Krimitsos here. Carol Franco asked, do you have these tools listed in any blog article? This is great info.
Yeah, I don't currently, but I will have maybe even the notes of the presentation available for everybody. I think we can send that out to any attendees that joined the webinar, and I'll be able to share those tools with anybody who's interested.
So I think that was the extent of the questions. Just a lot of comments of really cool stuff, pretty amazing. So thank you for bringing that to the fold. Lily, we'll defer to you for your session.
Terrific. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much. How has COVID-19 impact this podcast growth?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mentioned near the start just one aspect, right? So it's moving from listening to podcasts on your smartphones and automobiles to home systems. But there's also other systems that are being used. So things like televisions or gaming consoles. So the way or the place in which podcasts are being listened to is changing. And this now enables it to be, rather than kind of an individual thing, right, where you have your headphones in your ears and you're only listening to your podcast, to actually having kind of an entire group, whether it's roommates or as a family. So a podcast is now becoming more of a family experience rather than an individual one. And kind of the last thing that I found where there's a big shift is that the type of podcasts are being, there are different podcasts being listened to, right? Especially throughout COVID, there was lots of meditation and wellness type of podcasts that were being listened to rather than, say, travel or other things. But let's hope that this changes as the pandemic subsides over the next little while.
Okay, thank you so much.
Perfect.
That
Thanks
was
a lot.
really cool info. Great presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Mark, for hosting our Barcelona podcasters meetup.
Yes, of course. Always a pleasure.
That's why I also bring him up here. It's a great opportunity to speak to the world of podcasters.
So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.